and share my screen. Let's do that screen. Make sure that pulls up for everyone.
I'm seeing it.
Okay. Excellent. So, as Amy said, my name is Michael Goodman. I'm a geologist. Went into the environmental remediation space for several years, grew as a consultant, but ultimately wanted to find a more entrepreneurial adventure, and that's where I find myself now. Just me and a couple of others formed Guardian Plug and Abandonment. About a year and a half ago, we got started in this space. My partner is an ex-Shell employee or retired Shell employee. Worked for Getty Oil Company, Baker Hughes, and others. And for the last several years of his career, he was a superintendent plugging wells out in the Gulf of Mexico with Shell. And so he wanted to plug wells, to plug the difficult wells. And as we formed the company, we realized there's a great opportunity out there to generate carbon credits from measuring gas emissions and reducing gas emissions from plugging wells. And that's kind of been the road that we've been on for the last year and a half. So let me just jump right into this. I'll probably be, 25 minutes or so, but I'll slow down, and questions, happy to answer them probably at the end. But yeah, kind of like I introduced, Guardian Plug and Abandonment we're a carbon credit project developer. We generate high quality carbon credits. And I'll get into the details of that here soon. But in addition to carbon credit project development, we'll do project estimating, planning. We'll execute the carbon credit project. My partner especially will also do P&A project management and oversight work. And then, as Amy introduced, I'm also a qualified measurement specialist, and we'll do methane emission monitoring in the field. We can quantify leak rates, methane leak rates from wells and from other infrastructure. And then we are also in the carbon credit marketing and sales space of the industry, and we're trying to figure that out one day at a time. So the issue at hand is that there's so many wells out there. And here's some facts as reported by EDF. 80% of production sites are low producing wells. Okay, they produce less than 15 barrels of oil per day or equivalent in gas. That accounts for about 6% of the nation's oil and gas output. Yet, that 6% of the output emits roughly half of all the oil and gas well site methane emissions, according to this study. And then upstream oil and gas work in general accounts for 10 to 25% of total fossil fuel emissions. So there's a lot of gas emissions that come from these low producing sites, idle sites, inactive sites. And by plugging wells, by cleaning up sites, we are reducing those emissions. So that's kind of our company objective there, at least one of them. So let's jump into carbon credits. What are carbon credits? They are measurable, they're verifiable emissions reductions in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And that's just kind of the standard way of counting carbon credits in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Now you might ask, well, wells aren't emitting CO2. The primary component of natural gas is methane, CH4. Well, methane is anywhere from 25 to 84 times as potent as CO2. So when we convert methane to CO2, because methane will do 25 to 84 times the damage to the atmosphere as CO2, we multiply methane by that multiplier to convert it to CO2 equivalent. The types of projects that exist revolve around renewable energy, reforestation, energy efficiency, carbon capture, methane avoidance, etc. There are several different types of projects. And the one that we're focused on today it would be considered methane avoidance credits. By plugging wells, we're avoiding methane emissions. Projects are certified by following a public protocol established by a carbon registry. Now, that's a word you need to be familiar with, and we'll talk more about that. And then all the project work and calculations are verified by an independent third party. All carbon credit projects require third-party verification and validation by an independent third party. Okay, so here's the methodologies that are currently published revolving around plugging wells for carbon credits. There are many more in the works that aren't quite official yet, but these are the ones where there have been projects completed. So B-carbon is one. Their methodology applies to all abandoned wells, including orphaned wells. And the credit quantities are determined by quantifying the gas that can leak with a decline curve analysis of the production history, and then applying what's called a leak rate model. So we're geologists, I think most of us are. And so a decline curve analysis, I know this is really small, but this might be what a well produces, right? It's kind of a squiggly line of production, and it declines over time. Well, a decline curve analysis basically flattens that line out and estimates how much gas or oil is left in reserve. So with this methodology, we say, hey, the well stopped producing when it was making 50 MCF a day. Well, if we do a decline curve analysis, we can show, hey, there's still, 50,000 MCF in reserve that could produce over the next 20 years. That's the volume of gas that has the potential to leak. We apply that amount of gas to the leak rate model, and then we can forecast the amount of gas that could leak over the next 20 years. And that's based on, standard decline curve calculations that have been done to report to the SEC. I mean, it's a standard decline curve analysis. So that's one methodology with B-carbon. There are two methodologies that exist specifically for orphaned wells. One is with the American Carbon Registry, and the other is with Carbon Path. Both of them rely on measuring a leak rate to determine the credit quantities, and then you multiply that leak rate by the crediting period in order to determine the total volume of credits. ACR issues a 20-year crediting period, and Carbon Path issues a 50-year crediting period. I won't get into the details of why, but they have differing opinions on what makes sense. With this methodology, right, instead of having a decline curve or a decline, rate that the well could leak, we're basically assuming that that leak is going to stay steady for 20 years or for 50 years. And there are many factors that could change that, right? The leak could get worse if, the infrastructure breaks down, or if the wellhead is destroyed, or whatever else. The leak rate could get worse. But also, if the well is sitting there leaking at full capacity, it's just a hole in the ground and it's leaking gas, over time, that's going to decrease. As the formation depressurizes, right, as it leaks gas, you're going to run out of gas in the reservoir, and that leak rate is going to go down. And so there's maybe some issues. I mean, none of these are perfect per se, but I certainly see an issue with assuming that that leak rate is going to stay steady for 20 years or for 50 years following these methodologies. The last methodology I'll touch on real briefly is the idea of retiring active wells early. Carbon Path, same registry over here as here, they have a separate methodology that deals with determining how many reserves would have been produced had that well continued to produce. So this methodology applies only to active wells, and they forecast the reserves out to 10 years and say this is what would have been produced over the next 10 years, and that's how many credits it'll generate. And this comes out of their methodology. It's the same idea. It's a decline curve analysis. And if we plug the well here, at this time, then this volume here of reserves is what is converted into carbon credits, basically. And it's based on the refining. Well, it's based on the combustion of those oil and gas reserves and how much emissions would have come from the combustion of those reserves at the end of their life, if that makes sense. But I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail with that methodology. Yeah, not going to talk more about retiring wells early. I'll mention one quick note on the orphan well measuring leak rate methodologies. And then the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on this B-carbon approach because that's what I've implemented, and I want you guys to learn about this methodology. So real quick on the orphan well methodology. As we've mentioned, I am a qualified measurement specialist. We have this piece of equipment that measures leak rates. This is me out in the field. This is a well that lost its gas pipeline connection and was venting a whole bunch of gas, 60 or 70 MCF a day into the atmosphere. I came out here and I've measured this leak rate. Leak rate. It's not really a leak rate, it's a vent rate. But to my point earlier, these leak rates are bound to change. If they're leaking at full ambient conditions, then the leak rate is going to go down over time. If the leak rate is just a little bubble or a little hiss, it's bound to get worse over time. So the idea that we should just measure a leak rate in the field and then multiply that out by 20 or 50 years, I see the value in measuring a leak rate, but I don't necessarily think that's the most accurate we can be. And so for that reason, I'm going to talk about the B-carbon methodology. And so the rest of this presentation is going to focus on that. So the idea behind plugging idle gas wells for carbon credits. Well, the problem, if you will, is that these idle and orphan oil and gas wells exist in their abandoned state for decades. I've been to so many well sites where the well hasn't been touched in 10 years, 20 years. If you go to the Railroad Commission in Texas, their database of orphan wells, there are some wells on there that have been orphaned for over 30 years. And I'm sure Oklahoma has the same thing because Oklahoma has 2 or 3 times as many orphan wells as Texas does. In total, people estimate that there are over 3.5 million idle and orphan wells in the U.S. alone. And then, as I've hinted at, as wells age, seals degrade and infrastructure breaks down, and this is what leads to methane leaks. Methane is 25 to 84 times as potent as CO2. And the credits that we generate here adhere to the core carbon principles, which were developed by the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I won't go through all of this, but basically, these projects are really good carbon credit projects because there's good tracking, there's good transparency, there's independent third-party validation. It's additional, meaning that a lot of these wells wouldn't be plugged without the carbon market to incentivize it. There's a real permanence with plugging a well, right? Robust quantification, that's what we're going to talk about next. It's very sustainable, and it contributes to a net zero transition. So there's a lot of great things about these types of projects that I believe make these high quality carbon credits. Now, this next slide is something I put together to further emphasize why these credits are high quality carbon credits. As I've hinted at already, these are permanent solutions. These wells won't be plugged without the carbon market to incentivize action, which means they're additional. These credits are real. They stop real leaks. These emissions have been measured and confirmed in the field and with pictures and data. There are many co-benefits. They're beneficial to the community. Some wells are in neighborhoods. They're in urban and rural areas alike, and they reflect positively on the surrounding communities, both to people and wildlife. These credits are immediate. Emissions are stopped immediately, and it doesn't take 20 years to accumulate like a forestation project would. They're highly measurable, right? The B Carbon protocol relies on industry standard analyses to estimate gas volumes. They're third-party validated, and we provide all the data. Everything is transparent, from pictures to project plans to measurements to calculations. It's all provided in a very transparent way. With that being said, let's kind of jump into the methodology and how it works. B Carbon's methodology was established in 2023, so it's new, and I'm trying to be one of those people that educates people, along with Dan Arthur and others. The methodology applies to idle and orphan wells with gas production. In order to be eligible, the well needs to be in compliance. Can't have outstanding compliance issues. The well has to be registered as non-producing, or there needs to be no net production in 3 months or more. Well's got to be located in the US or Canada. And here's the most important piece, in my opinion at least. We've got to detect methane at the surface in excess of about 2 parts per million. We've got to show that the well is leaking, that there are methane emissions at the well. That's the premise behind the whole methodology. So that if we don't plug this well will leak. And we've got to show that it is already leaking, that there is already methane escaping to the surface. So the process, credit quantities are based on how much methane could leak based on what's in reserve. So again, we do a decline curve analysis from the last 48 months of production data. And then we apply a leak rate model. And it projects the volume of methane that can leak over the next 20 years. 20 years is the crediting period. We've got to have the methane concentration from the gas, right? We've got to know if it's 70% methane or 95% methane, because that's a direct multiplier in the equations. And then we've got to subtract out the project emissions, and we've got to do a discount for uncertainty. This slide was developed by ALL Consulting, and it's part of it's on B Carbon's website. Again, just re-emphasizing really though, we do the decline curve model, and we figure out from there the annual decline rate, the ADR, and the last production estimate, the LPE. Those inputs from the decline curve model are applied to the leak rate model. And then the leak rate model calculates the gross emissions reductions. Then, as I mentioned, we've got to subtract out project emissions. We keep track of the hours and the time and the amount of cement used, and calculate the amount of emissions the project generated. And then we've got to take out a discount for uncertainty. Adding those together and subtracting, we can then calculate the net emissions reductions. As a project developer, it's important to know the process to work with B Carbon. So for any of you that might consider being a project developer, this is how it works working with B Carbon. We first submit the provisional project plan, which is then reviewed by B Carbon and by the third-party validators. Wells are then plugged. Then we write, as the project developer, we got to write the final project plan, the FPP, which is then validated by the third party and looked at by B Carbon as well. 80% of the credits are issued at that time once everything is approved and we've got the plugging record from the regulatory agency. We've got to do a post-plugging test to make sure that there are no emissions from the well, from the former wellhead or the well bore after it's been plugged. And then 80% of the credits are issued. A year later, we do a second test to confirm that there are no emissions at the site, and then the remaining 20% of the credits are issued by B Carbon at that time. So this is a rough timeline of how things might go for a project, right? It might take us as a project developer maybe a month to get some agreements in place with the operator we're working with the owner of the well. Then we've got to do a site visit to demonstrate that the wells are leaking, right? That there's some methane at the site. That might take us a month or so. It'll take us about another month to register the project, to submit the provisional project plan, to get the third party to validate the project plan. And then depending on the size of the project, it might take 1, 2, 3, or even longer than that, months to plug the well, restore the sites, execute all the work in the field. We've got to be there as the project developer a few times for some site visits during plugging, after plugging. And then it might take us a month afterwards to finalize the project, do the final project plan, get it submitted, get it approved, and then the credits are issued. And this timeline is real rough, but it's based on some experience and based on forecasted projects moving forward on our part. So that's kind of the overview of the methodology, but I want to talk a bit about projects we've completed. So we've done 2 projects with B-Carbon kind of simultaneously. We completed these projects, and they are the Rice Ranch project and the Carlton project. So let me jump into these and show you how we completed these projects. So these wells are located in increasingly urban environments. You can see the map in the background. We're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The Rice Ranch wells were up here in Flower Mound, which is actually where I was born and where I grew up. And then the Carlton project is located down here in Mansfield area, kind of on the south edge of the kind of urban development. You know, these wells were idle wells, and they had some minor, albeit methane leaks at the surface. And altogether, they generated over 1 million carbon credits because they were fairly prolific gas wells, and they had a lot of gas in the reservoir at the end of their life. So here's some project details. On the left is the Carlton unit wells, 2 gas wells drilled in 2009. You know, the gas was 95% plus methane, and they were producing around, 250 MCF per day each. There were some methane leaks at the surface, some infrastructure breaking down, but there was a lot of water production at these sites, and that's what led to these wells being uneconomical at that time. Just so much water production that the disposal costs were eating away at the profits, and so the wells were no longer producing. The Rice Ranch wells, there were 4 of them. They were drilled about the same time, 2010. Also 95% plus methane. They were producing a bit lower rate, but there were also some methane leaks at the surface, at the tanks, some methane emissions throughout the site. And again, they were also in the Barnett Shale, similar formation, and they had too much water production and were just sitting there idle. So here's what our project planning looked like. We did site visit. We collected photos. We documented the presence of methane at the site. We sourced historical production data. Then we ran the decline curve analysis, and here's our outputs from the decline curve analysis, the ADR, the decline rate, and the last production estimate. We ran the leak rate model, and here's a snippet from that, and all in all, it generated, this many carbon credits from this particular well. Add all of those up, and that was the total amount of GHG emissions that these wells were going to, that we prevented by plugging these wells. This project plan was submitted to B-Carbon and the third-party validators for approval. And here's the next slide. Here's a bit more on the project execution. Once that was all approved, we plugged the wells. We filed the plugging record. We conducted a post-P&A test to confirm that there were no methane emissions. Submitted the final project plan to B-Carbon, and here's the table of contents. You can see that, it's a long project plan, right? A lot of material was put together for this project. Third-party validator, which on this project was ALL Consulting, they validated the project and made sure all the inputs were correct. B-Carbon then issued 80% of the credits to us as the project developer. 1 year later, we'll need to go back, which will be in October or September, October timeframe this year, to the site to confirm that there are no methane leaks, and then B-Carbon will issue the remaining 20% of the carbon credits to us. Here's the sites, immediately after the wells were plugged, large pads, and they are now cleared completely. This landowner here requested that we leave these markers in place to show where the well bores were located, but they also wanted the pad in place. That was the agreement with the landowner, and that's what they requested per the lease agreement. But that's what the site looked like after everything was taken down. The results. So I don't need to go through each one of these numbers. You can take a look at them, but here's the Carlton wells on the left and the Rice Ranch wells on the right. And in total, 1,097,000 credits were issued in October of 2024, and the remaining 20% or 274,000 will be issued next year. And that's kind of the closure of the project. And so now we are, as a project developer, selling those credits, and we're kind of locked into a sales agreement at this time, and are well on our way to getting that completed. So next, I wanted to talk about a project pitch. We are trying to go about this in many different ways. This particular project is a project that we are looking for a partner. We're potentially looking for somebody to fund this, maybe even an operator to take over these orphaned wells with us, and we can partner up. So this is a pitch that we're working on, and we'd like to execute this project. It's the Urbana Field, orphan well project. So here's kind of an introductory slide, that we're trying to pitch to maybe a Fortune 500 company that wants to support this kind of work, right? We would like to find a large company that wants to sponsor this work. They want to, work together to adopt orphan wells, permanently plug them, and stop methane leaks. So here's the Urbana Field. It was founded in the 1990s. It's located in a rural neighborhood outside of Cleveland, Texas. Due to bankruptcy in 2010, operators left behind 16 wells that are now orphaned, which means they belong to nobody. By voluntarily plugging these wells, we'll stop methane leaks and restore lands for local neighborhood residents. Okay, the red dots on this map, this is from the Railroad Commission's website. Those are the orphan wells. And you can see that this is a rural neighborhood with, homes throughout this plot of land. So there are 16 orphan wells. This is 20 minutes from Cleveland and about 1 hour from downtown Houston. Wells are leaking methane, and based on the decline curve analysis and the leak rate model, we're looking at preventing, over about 850,000 tons of CO2 emissions. So just a little bit more on this project. Here's the neighborhood, right? There's tanks, there's wellheads, there's facilities, and then there's houses. And, on this bottom picture here, you can see in the same frame the tankage with the wellheads wherever they are, and then, private residents, touching the piece of property right there on the left. And so this is a project we want to tackle, but we're looking for somebody to sponsor the project, and or an operator that wants to take ownership of the wells. We're trying to figure this project out, how we can properly close this field. The project execution would basically be permanently plugging the wells, having the third-party validator approve the project, confirming that there's no methane leaks afterwards, and then we'll have the carbon credits issued to us by B Carbon. And what we're trying to do is take sites like this and really just turn them into this, right? That's the project. That's the goal of all of these projects. So anyway, I hope I gave you a good kind of introduction to Carbon Credit Project, and I gave you some details on how to execute a project with B Carbon. We're a project developer group out of Conroe, Texas, which is north of Houston, and we're looking to grow. We're looking to execute more projects, and I hope that you learned something from this, and feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to answer any questions, and here's some contact information. And I owe a lot of credit to many people who have helped me learn and helped me along my way as a project developer. So anyway, thank you for your time, and happy to have some questions now.
We did have one question. Are you willing to share your slide deck with folks?
Yeah, that's fine. I can do that. I'll share it with you, Amy, and you can distribute it.
Okay. And I did record this, so that should be available in here in a day or two, and I'll put that on the TGS YouTube channel. If people want to listen to Michael explain all this again too. We've got a question from Steve.
Yeah, hi, Michael. Thank you for such a quality presentation. Well, his main question was, how did you come across these orphan wells, these wells that were basically ignored?
Yeah, so for the Urbana Field project, or for the project we completed in Dallas area?
Well, if there's a commonality, I mean, if you don't mind spending a little
Sure.
bit of time on each one of them, that'd be great.
Sure. So our approach is multifaceted, I guess. We have a lot of connections to the oil and gas industry. Just my partners and people that I work with, we've got a lot of connections to small operators, and per the B carbon methodology, we can work with small operators to plug their wells that wouldn't otherwise be plugged. And so just through our network, we're able to connect with all sorts of different people that have wells and that would like to explore options for getting these plugged. So that's how some of our projects work. This project that we completed in the Dallas area actually came about through the landowner. The landowner was complaining about wells on his property that were inactive and that he wanted to get rid of. And through a series of people, we came in contact with the landowner, and then the landowner introduced us to the owner of the wells, and that's how we were able to complete that Dallas project that we did. And then the orphan well project is actually from operators saying that they have some history with the field and they would like to get this field cleaned up. And so they've come to us and said, hey, can we do this? And at this point, we're looking for, a guarantee that we can either sell the credits, or we're looking for somebody that would be happy to kind of fund the project up front, either way.
Thank you, sir.
Does that answer your question, Steve?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for that
Sure.
quick rundown.
We've got a question from Daryl Pennington also, it looks like. Daryl, you might be muted.
I'm happy to go if he's trying to figure out his.
I say go ahead, and then we'll come back to Daryl.
So, Michael, we should talk. I'm interested in the Urbana project, and I have an operator that bonded operator that could take those over and so forth. So, we should talk about that. We're very happy to have been the VVB for your projects in the Barnett, and hope to see a lot more of that. But I do have one comment or question is, have you looked at, if you look at the state of Texas, about 1% of the permits that they issue are for reentries. Have you looked at working with, say, the mineral interest owner or landowner to permanently decommission the wellbore?
Well, let me back up a little bit. Dan, thank you. I appreciate everything. I've learned a lot from you, and appreciate your group doing the verification on this project. And yeah, would be happy to talk about the Urbana project. To answer your question, I didn't know that statistic of 1% that you mentioned there, and I find that interesting, and I probably need to be doing some more research on that. But no, that is not something I've really dug into.
Daryl, have you still got a question? I think you're still on mute, and I can't unmute you. Not gonna work. You can type something in the chat too if you want. Sorry.
We've got a question in the chat from Ken. I can go
Yeah.
ahead and look at that one. He says, I have not followed the carbon credit process. How are they turned into cash? So that is something I didn't focus on in this presentation, and perhaps I could have. I'll give a brief little introduction. The credits that we generate they're not tax credits, they're not regulatory credits. These are voluntary carbon credits, which means that companies can use them to voluntarily reduce their carbon footprint. It's companies that are claiming to be net zero or carbon neutral, or they're looking to reduce their emissions by 50%, or whatever their claim is. Carbon credits are a tool for companies to reduce their carbon footprint. And so it's a lot of Fortune 500 companies. You might see ads, maybe you don't, but maybe you do. They're out there. They're ads that from companies claiming to be carbon neutral by 2030 or something like that. And so the process for how to sell them is really it's really up in the air. There's a lot of different ways to sell them. There's a lot of platforms and marketplaces and kind of bulletin board websites that'll list your credits for sale. But then a lot of sales are done just kind of business to business, and there's no kind of marketing or platform where they're posted for sale necessarily. So it's the Wild West, really.
Wow.
We're working with a broker that has a couple of Fortune 500 buyers, and they've committed to buying from them, and those brokers are then, contracting us to be able to provide them with credits to fulfill their needs. So it's a tangled web of people trying to figure it out, is my impression. But I'm sure Dan has more opinions as well. If you want to add your opinion, Dan.
Now, what is that B carbon name that you put on? As I said, I haven't been following this, but I want to get at least have an awareness.
B carbon is the registry. They are the body that wrote the methodology for how to quantify the credits that you'll generate. They're the ones that issue the credits once you've completed the project completely. And then those credits are ours. They're issued on blockchain. And then it's our responsibility as the project developer to then turn around and sell them to an interested party.
Is that a nationwide organization? Is it private or is that government?
Actually, it's a nonprofit. It's a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization. It's not a regulated entity. It is a nonprofit company that looks to provide solutions for companies that want to reduce their carbon footprint.
Thank you.
B Carbon has other protocols too for nature-based soil. It's kind of started out of Rice University, but the neat thing about this, Ken, is in building the protocol here, and there's different registries that'll have protocols, for instance.
Yeah.
But this one had a stakeholder group of about 400 people, including folks from Exxon to the Environmental Defense Fund that came together, coordinated, and helped come to agreement on a protocol that they believed was high quality.
Thank you very much.
I think Daryl had a similar question. So is everybody good?
Yeah, well, Daryl's talking about the value of the carbon credits that are on the market. A lot of credits in the last year from various methodologies, well, they have various price points depending on the types of projects they are. A lot of voluntary credits are selling anywhere between $5 and $8 a credit. B0 is a carbon credit rating agency, and they've got a lot of data on this since they rate projects and the quality of projects, and they've seen a lot of projects sell at the $8 mark. I think for these credits, we're hoping to see them start to sell, around 15, maybe even pushing $20 a credit. But it's the value is in the eye of the beholder, and I don't like to say that, but it kind of feels that way right now. We've had people come say that they're worth 30 cents, and we've had others promise $50, and it's really just, that's my opinion at least, and my perception.
So
I'll add this, Michael, is that credit so far for the plugin stuff is sold from $16 to $28 of completed transactions on the public side. But what I will say is even in the compliance market, operators are paying $30 a ton in California to offset their stuff, which is required.
Yep.
If you look at non-attainment areas, equivalent carbon credits there would go from about $45 to $70 a ton. And I'll say that there's B2B sales, including very recently, that have gone from $20 to $60 a ton for well plugging.
Yep, that's good context. And Washington State also has a compliance market, which is even more pricey than California, from what I understand, in the 50, 60, maybe even higher range. But that's more or less the range, Daryl. I know that's a big range.
Okay. Fred, have you got a question?
Yes, I have a few questions. And I'm outside, the oil patch, so forgive me if some of these questions are a little off the wall here. When you're at a well site and you said that you were taking a measurement of the amount of methane, and what you call a leaking well, I assume that methane can come through the well bore or outside the well bore?
Yeah, that's correct. Leaks can happen right directly up the production string. There can happen at seals at the master valve. Leaks can happen all over the place.
Okay. So if the leak is outside the well bore and you so-called, go out there and plug, the well to the best of your ability, the methane is still being released to the atmosphere, correct? If it's outside the well bore?
No, so
No.
plugs are set, thousands of feet down where the producing intervals are at, and there are several plugs and cast iron bridge plugs put in the well bore across drinking water zones, across casing string size differences, and so when the well is plugged properly down at depth, and then several plugs later all the way up to the surface, there isn't an opportunity for methane to leak out the soil. It'll be stopped long before it gets to the surface where soil is located.
Okay. Now, on the figure that you gave, you had, credits, and those credits is not in a unit of dollars, and you kind of addressed that. My question would be is, on a so-called average well, you have a plug and abandon cost.
Mhm.
And then when it comes to the credits, how much more are the credits exceed the plug and abandon cost of the well?
Yep, it really depends. The P&A cost for a very basic well can be thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. Most wells on land that aren't just a huge pain in the rear would probably be less than $100,000 to plug and restore the site. If you get into some bay waters out here in Galveston Bay, you're looking at $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 per well to plug. And the amount of credits that a well generates is not based on how much the well costs to plug. It's based on how much gas is left in reserve and how much gas can leak to the atmosphere. So the cost of plugging is not related to the quantity of credits a well will generate. So some projects that we look at simply are not worth doing because there's no gas left in reserve and they're expensive to plug. Whereas some others are the opposite, where they're not very expensive to plug, but they can generate a lot of credits because there's a lot of gas left in reserve that can leak. And so, like we've talked about, this project generated currently over 1 million credits, and if those sell at $10 or $15, that's more than going to pay for the plug and abandonment of these wells. But that's not always the case.
Okay, I just have one more question, and oh, I know what it was. Basically the history that you gave on the wells, they were relatively new. They were built, they were, abandoned or drilled and abandoned in the 1990s. So it doesn't, seem that they were, that old. And my question is I get the impression that this program somewhat takes the operator off the hook on, properly abandoning these wells. Is
Yeah.
that a bit of a true comment or not?
Well, the responsibility to plug the wells will always be with the operator of record, with the regulatory agency. But you're right in the sense that carbon finance can bring an incentive to plug the well and provide a way to plug it without digging into your pockets per se. B carbon, an important clarification I need to make is that B carbon does say that eligible wells are only those that wouldn't be plugged without the carbon market to incentivize taking action. Meaning these operators have no money. They're not planning on plugging these wells. At the end of their life, these operators are planning on filing bankruptcy and causing these wells to become orphan wells.
Okay, so this may be like a regulatory issue. I would think that the Railroad Commission, maybe, they're not set up like this. Doesn't the operator have to set aside financial assurance before a well is drilled? So there's money always there, no matter what the situation is with the life of the well, that well's going to, there's money there that well will be plugged and abandoned.
The answer is yes, there is money there, but it's not nearly enough. I mean, you can get a bond for 100 wells for, right, maybe a few $100,000, but the cost to plug 100 wells is going to be in the millions of dollars, and so
Yeah,
there's
right.
never enough money. So what happens when an operator goes bankrupt is, yes, the state regulatory agency, Oklahoma Corporation Commission or the Railroad Commission, takes that bond money, puts it into the orphan well fund for plugging wells. And that is what it's supposed to do. The problem is it's just not enough. It's not enough. Not even close.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Steve, do you have another question?
Yes, well, I wanted to thank Fred for the questions he asked. That's why my hand kind of went up and down a little bit. And so partial answers to some of the thoughts I was having. One of the things that I think that saw Dan shaking his head, if the gas is escaping from a flow line that's not connected to the well anymore, or that can be disconnected and then isolated, then that's not a leak that applies to the well abandonment process. Okay. That will apply to the abandonment of the surface facility that may be connected to that well in some way or form, like the Dallas examples that showed the complete hookup was still in place. And then to expand a little bit on what Michael said, this is a national problem, and to reinforce what Michael also said is there's just no money available to deal with the magnitude of the problem in terms of well count of orphan and idle wells that are going to need plugging. What's disturbing to me is to see this wholesale, and I'm trying not to be partisan here, but continue to drill, baby, drill going on. This more holes you put in the ground are more holes that have to be remedied. And Dan will tell you, some of these wells go back 100 years, and there's casing all rotted out, cement job gone. Those wells, even the shallow ones, are not going to be cheap to fix. And there just really isn't any money. And whether it's government money, bonding that was put in place by former operators that are now gone broke. So it's a huge problem for the country as a whole. And of course, the 5 key states, they're Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and or Northeast up there, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, where the wells are concentrated. That's where the lion's share of the work is going to get to be done. So it really was kind of a comment and more than a question. I just want to thank Michael. Michael, you've really got up to speed on this in a big way. I'm really just trying to get up to speed myself, and just like Dan, I'd be interested in visiting more with you about partnering.
Be happy to talk about it, Steve. Thanks for the comment.
All right. We got any more questions? This has been really, really interesting. Thank you, Michael. This has been a good explanation of just how the whole process works with the carbon credits and plugging well.
Yeah, it's a new adventure, and everyone that says they're an expert at it is lying because it's new for everybody. And we are figuring this out. Dan is very much on the forefront of this, and we've completed some projects, so we're well on our way at this point as well. But we still have a lot to learn and a lot to figure out. And I'm just kind of beginning my journey of learning how we're going to actually execute all of this. Fred, you got another question?
Fred, do you have another question, or does anyone else?
Are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can go ahead and, ask my next question.
Sure.
Okay. Mike, I don't know how many different state agencies you have dealt with. And my question would be, is the difference in the state agencies, how does that vary?
Yeah, I've dealt primarily with Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. A little bit with Pennsylvania and Utah. They all need more money because they don't have the budgets to plug wells. They all have orphan wells, and they all don't have solutions to plug all of those orphan wells. So state agencies are happy to see that carbon credit projects are working because it gets more wells off of their list to plug. They're backlogged years and years and years and decades with wells to plug, and if people are voluntarily going in there and taking ownership of an orphan well and plugging it, that just takes one more off their list, and the state is happy to do that. I haven't seen any state complain or say anything negative about these types of projects.
Okay. I thought maybe want to have regulations that, far exceed or just, quite a bit different than, the others.
Yeah, as far as the plugging requirements go, they're not that different. Sure, there are some differences, and I don't know them all, but the basics are the basics. They want cast iron bridge plugs. They want to pull the packer. You want to put at least 100-foot cement plugs across the different intervals. It's not that much different.
Okay. Thank you.
That's all. So thank you, D. Michael. This was, this was really interesting. I think everybody enjoyed kind of learning more of the nuts and bolts of this process. And there's a lot of wells out there. So.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, great job, Mike.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.